Hello, my name is Lars Nielsen, and I am neither a podcaster nor a YouTuber, but I have something that I feel I should say to the world with regards to Ensign Peak Advisors, which is a 501c3 supporting organization to the Mormon Church. So it turns out that the Mormon Church is a huge collection of legal entities and corporations that are nested inside one another, and all of those are ultimately governed by one legal entity at the very top called the Corporation of the President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So throughout this presentation, we're just going to refer to it as the COP. And likewise, Ensign Peak Advisors will just be called EPA for short. Now, the COP is a, quote, corporation sole. That means that it has just one owner. And currently that owner is Russell M. Nelson. Now, inside of this pyramid, there is a myriad of for-profit businesses, church operations, of course, university operations, Tabernacle Choir on Temple Square. And each one of those organizations has its own cash on hand, its own savings account, and of course, its own reserves. But off to the side, not in this pyramid, is Ensign Peak Advisors. It is the, quote, reserve of the reserves. And they call it an auxiliary because it is controlled by the COP, but as a 501c3 supporting organization, it has no owners. So the nice thing about achieving 501c3 status is that it allows for any money that enters into that organization to just grow and grow tax-free until it is needed. But of course, there's a catch, and that is that every dollar that goes into the organization must be permanently dedicated to a religious, educational, or charitable purpose. So here's an actual copy of the first 2 pages of EPA's Articles of Incorporation. This is essentially the representation that the COP made to the IRS to substantiate EPA as a tax-exempt organization, stating its intent to be a truly active, functional, and integrated supporting auxiliary to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So, has the COP used EPA in a manner that is consistent with the Articles of Incorporation and with its 501c3 tax-exempt status? The first big problem that the EPA has is that it has never made even one single distribution to a religious, educational, or charitable purpose at all in 22 years since its inception. It is a supporting organization that has never done any supporting. So the second big problem is that it made 2 unlawful distributions according to the IRS code between 2009 and 2014. And we'll talk about those misapplications of funds in detail a little bit more later on. But let's first examine how serious it is to make a false representation to the IRS and to never correct it, to just let it go on quarter after quarter for 22 years, willfully covering it up. I remember Gordon B. Hinckley saying in an interview that the church is not transparent about its finances because, he says, that information belongs to the membership, not to the public.
Well, we simply think that that information belongs to those who made the contribution and not to the world. That's the only thing.
But then he doesn't tell the members, even though they ask. And he says that information belongs to them. It is my opinion, based on the facts that I'm going to share with you, that the COP never had the intention from day one of using the EPA to do any religious, educational, or charitable work. So to keep the video moving at a good pace, I'm not going to make every citation that I put in the footnotes or in the endnotes of the full paper, but you can find that in the links underneath this video. On this topic, one court decided, quote, it is axiomatic that a charitable trust is invalid if it was created for an illegal purpose. Let's take a closer look at when EPA was incorporated. September 29th, 1997. That's one reactionary month after Time magazine broke its cover story of Mormons, Inc. and boldly stated that, quote, Salt Lake City was just for starters. The Mormons' true great trek has been to social acceptance and a 30 billion church empire. At that time, the COP had an investment department and its reserve of the reserves had only grown to about 12 billion. Time magazine probably didn't have access to that figure when it tried to calculate the enterprise value of the entire Mormon church, but from what I gather, and please keep in mind that of course I was a student at BYU in 1997, so some of the things that I'm going to relate to you are clearly third hand. So from what I gather, the COP realized that a single lawsuit or a federally required audit of one of its university student loan programs, for example, could expose to the world, including the IRS and COP's membership in general, exactly how much tithing surplus it puts away year after year and how big those funds get growing without being used. Really quickly, for the uninitiated viewers of this video, the CEO of the COP is called a prophet. And the prophet at the time, 1997, was Gordon B. Hinckley, who oversaw the transformation of the investment department into Ensign Peak Advisors, specifically for the purpose of hiding from the world, from the membership, from the IRS, how much tithing surplus was not getting spent. So, time out. How big are those funds right now? Let's take a look at this framework and exposures document, which was produced by an EPA employee in March of 2013. So I added everything that you see in red on top of the original slide, and all of this is Exhibit K in the full paper. You can see the investment department's growth in orange starting from 1969, and then in the blue section, which refers to the Ensign Peak years, here we are with the financial crisis in 2008 that caused a bit of a dip in the investment assets. Of course, they subsequently recovered. And off to the right, in light and dark green, EPA leadership projected, and this projection was done in 2013, anywhere between 5% and 9% total growth through 2022, so that basically at its 25-year anniversary, it would have a private capitalization, or net worth, since the firm carries no debt, of between $77 and $112 billion. The actual number in November of 2019 is between 99 and 101 billion, which I indicate with a large red data point. I'm pretty comfortable extrapolating based on historical contribution and investment return rates that the owned assets under management, or OAUM, will be pretty close to 135 billion at that 25-year anniversary. So they're doing pretty well, exceeding expectations, that's for sure. So, silently, soberly celebrating are the 10, maybe 15 people who know that the COP's stockpile just passed $100 billion this year. You know, it really makes me wonder how that lonely woman who gave her last farthing every year for 2 decades and hasn't paid her heating bill this month will celebrate the good news, especially when she realizes that EPA has never spent any money ever on feeding the poor, clothing the naked, or housing the homeless. That is not what the public expects when it gives tax-exempt status to an organization. EPA is clearly in exponential growth mode, and it is clearly in 0% charity mode. Once the money goes in, it gets reinvested perpetually, it never comes out. It is a black hole that swallows the widow's mite and never burps. Some of you might remember that Newsweek in 2011, I think, stated that the LDS Church, quote, resembles a sanctified multinational corporation, the General Electric of American religion, with global ambitions and an estimated net worth of $30 billion. The Mormon Church had 11 billion more than 30 billion in the shoebox alone at the time. Bloomberg, with its rigorous valuation methods, got a little closer in 2012 with an estimated net worth of 40 billion. But the shoebox was 6 billion bigger the next year at 47 billion total, and again, bigger than the entire estimate. Neither of these reporting agencies, and it's not their fault, even hit the target, let alone the bullseye. I'd now like to take you on a deep dive into what that big red dot on this figure represents. So let's look at Exhibit A, which we'll call the EPA universe. I know there's a lot of information on this slide, but first, let me mention this slide was created by an EPA employee in the normal course of duties during 2019, but using data from February of 2018 across all of EPA's investment portfolios. It just turns out that this was the best time to assemble the information to get an accurate snapshot of everything at once. Obviously, the organization has had almost 2 full years of contribution and investment returns to get us to the present. There are 6 investment portfolios depicted here from orange to teal. You can see that 35.7% of the market value of the entire EPA allocated capital was in the U.S. equity portfolio, which basically means stocks and indexes of stocks that yield dividends and generate capital gains. 9.9% was in the international equity or foreign exchange portfolio. 5.2% was in private equity. 21.7% was in credit duration, which basically means bonds with their interest payments, etc. 7.7% was in hybrid instruments that have a mixture of investment characteristics. And then 2.5% of the allocated capital was cash at about $2.4 billion. This is in addition to the Treasury cash, which at the time was $4.5 billion. And this is where the tithing surplus from the COP comes into the EPA, into this account, and it just waits until it gets big enough that chunky allocations to the whole portfolio just start happening. Basically, money is swept weekly from thousands of bank accounts, mostly in the United States and Canada, where those members' contributions are first deposited, and then the COP gives another legal entity, this is all at a very high level, called the Corporation of the Presiding Bishopric, or CPB, whatever it needs to run the expenses of the Mormon Church, like pay the electricity bills, or campaign against marriage equality, or to top off any struggling areas throughout the world with supplemental funds. And then the rest of it flows into this treasury account, and from there into the investment portfolio. It turns out that the COP likes to keep its real estate assets in 2 separate legal entities called Ag Reserves Inc., or ARI, and Property Reserves Inc., or PRI. So their valuations are technically not on the EPA balance sheet, but apparently the COP leaders like to see it put alongside the other investments, and that is where we get the figure that today, all in, is the EPA universe, or about $124 billion. Before moving on to the next point, let's review how all of this is structured by looking at Exhibit C. So the money comes in from members. Internal estimates put the total annual tithing contribution at about $7 billion per year. Maybe $5 or $6 billion goes out as expenditures. That's again managed by CPB. And that would be on churches, temples, universities, all that jazz. And then $1 or $2 billion flow to EPA each year. Off to the left, I added to the slide kind of an analogy, I guess. The COP's main account is kind of like a no-interest checking account. And this part is really important. Only never invested tithing surplus makes it into the EPA Treasury account, which is analogous to like a savings account where you get a slightly better interest rate than you could in your own checking account. After a while, it migrates into the long-term retirement account where it purchases stocks and bonds and the like. There it gets fully mixed with prior tithing capital and realized gains from prior invested tithing. The church makes absolutely no effort to separate pure tithing from returns on pure tithing once the funds move over from the treasury to the allocated capital. As you'll see later, that's important because leaders and apologists keep saying that the sacred money is kept separate, but it's not. Now, of course, the COP could make a capital call for religious, educational, and charitable purposes, but it never has. 2 times money has come back from EPA and into for-profit concerns on the COP side, but again, those were not qualified distributions. So where did that money go? Let's look at Exhibit B. This slide was also made within the EPA. These are the biggest affiliates and relationships that EPA had at the time, and they haven't really changed much since then. The first distribution went to Beneficial Financial Group, BFG. Remember in 2009 when the federal government was bailing out the church's preferred bank, Zions Bank? And it turns out that at the same time, the church was silently bailing out Beneficial Financial Group with a $600 million check to keep it from collapsing. Clearly, the church wanted to avoid the publicity and humiliation of a failed, church-owned, for-profit business, so they had EPA make a non-publicly disclosed outflow to BFG. Their mistake, of course, was that the money that they used was irrevocably dedicated to religious, educational, or charitable purposes. They could have moved money around between the COP's for-profit businesses, but then tons of businessmen would know that something was up. They didn't want that, so using EPA money was fast, and as long as nobody told the IRS, then nobody in the world would know. Well, now you know. To be clear, this was not an investment. There is no loan on EPA's balance sheet with Beneficial Life. This was a certain outflow, an unqualified distribution under the table. BFG never paid it back because there was no expectation that it had to. And this was done using 100% tithing money. The check was cut from the EPA Treasury account before it had a chance to ever get invested. In the essentials, it's the same story with this second misapplication of funds. EPA paid $1.4 billion exclusively using tithing on the cost overruns associated with building the City Creek Mall between 2009 and 2014. The financing plan for the mall was clearly also impacted by the 2008 financial crisis. Now, EPA did not make an investment in the mall or give it a loan. No such investment or loan receivable appears on EPA's balance sheet. The mall is on PRI's balance sheet. This is important because the Ensign magazine said in 2006, quote, "No tithing funds will be used in the redevelopment." That might have been the plan, but that's not what happened, and no one ever revealed the whole truth to the members afterwards. In 2007, the Deseret News reported, quote, "Money for the project is not coming from LDS church members' tithing donations. City Creek Center is being developed by Property Reserve, Inc., the church's real estate development arm, and its money comes from other real estate ventures." Well, here are the facts. PRI does receive some money from other real estate ventures, but it also receives most of its money from tithing surplus. We saw that on Exhibit C. Here's another fact. PRI did finance some of the City Creek Mall, but most of the financing came from EPA using exclusively never invested tithing dollars, $1.4 billion. 5 years later, Keith McMullen, a member of the corporation of the presiding bishopric at the time, reportedly said to the Salt Lake Tribune, quote, "Not one penny of tithing goes to the church's for-profit endeavors. Specifically, the church has said no tithing went toward City Creek Center." Notice that he didn't say that was true of himself. He said that the church had said that in the past. But the fact is, checks from EPA's treasury containing only never invested tithing had already been written by the time Mr. McMullen made this intentionally misleading public statement. So this is just one of many examples of misdirection, smoke and mirrors that comes out of COP leadership and their public affairs department. But the question that I have right now is, how is it that the very smart EPA employees somehow not realize or ask fundamental questions about what is really going on with the firm? As you can see from this slide, Exhibit G, the EPA tells its own employees in its new staff orientation guide that it's a tax-exempt organization basically for 4 reasons. Number 1, it makes withdrawals for prophetic initiatives like building the conference center and temples. But does that happen? Nope. Here's the alternate version of that same slide that went to the presiding bishopric instead of the new employees at the same time. In the full paper, this is Exhibit D. Notice that it says, examples of withdrawals. Conference center, $0, funded out of the COP operating budget. Temple construction, $0. That was also funded out of the COP operating budget. Are any of these other things listed prophetic initiatives? Neither of the 2 bailouts were prophetic. They were very reactionary and unlawful, unfortunately. Number 2 is a resounding no. The COP has never asked EPA to help balance a budget. The COP moves tithing around and tops off the coffers all upstream to EPA activity. And this includes helping in areas of the world where those third countries can't sustain themselves with their own tithing. EPA is definitely the reserve of the reserves. To overuse the "my cup runneth over" reference, EPA gets what runneth over the last of many filled cups. Okay, number 3 on the list was to backstop the pension if it ever got into trouble, and to be ready to help affiliates like BYU with their big growth plans. Nothing on either score has ever happened. I remember working in a chemistry lab at BYU, and I had to use the most outdated, defunct equipment compared to what I would later use in graduate school. And that was all on the pretense that the Lord's University was this house of economy, and we all needed to do our part to protect the widow's mite. But seriously, in 1 year, every lab at BYU could be better equipped than every lab at Harvard University, without any dip to the annual growth curve. Harvard's endowment is the largest endowment in the country, at $38 billion. The EPA universe is 3 times that. No, there's just no argument here. EPA does not support anything educational at all, and the COP penny pinches its university research programs. It's so weird. Number 4 on the list was to post collateral for COP operations. This is just a filler bullet point, desperate to make the list just even a little bit longer. Anyone who knows the IRS code can tell you that vouching for another firm is not a fiscal activity for a supporting organization. So, 0 for 4. I don't think that the EPA can honestly point to any activity at all in 22 years that remotely comports with a tax-exempt purpose. And it didn't seem to feel any responsibility to the non-Mormon public that gave it tens of billions of dollars in tax breaks, and with the expectation that it would be doing something with that public trust. What is the purpose of setting up a 501c3 supporting organization that has never done and probably will never do any charitable supporting? Tax evasion, yeah, that's part of the truth. Hiding your wealth is closer to the mark. But why? So what could possibly be the reason for hoarding such a ridiculous sum of money? Or if not for hoarding, for simply not doing anything religious, educational, or charitable? So let's just explore some of the possibilities. Incapability. If the church is packing away $1 billion or $2 billion each year from excess tithing contributions and making $7 billion per year on investments, to keep it from growing, it would have to spend $8 billion per year on something humanitarian. The church simply doesn't have the infrastructure to spend that kind of money. And per the Articles of Incorporation, EPA can't give money to organizations like the Bill Gates Foundation or the Red Cross. Those are not named supported organizations of EPA when it was incorporated. So the COP, not the EPA, would have to go into a formal partnership with someone huge like the IMF or the World Bank and hand over all $8 billion of its immediately obtained tithing money every year, and then pull out of EPA $8 billion from the reserves to just run church operations instead of using current tithing. I mean, that would be a legal way to do it, but what member is going to pay tithing to the COP knowing that it goes straight out to the World Bank? They're going to make their charitable contributions elsewhere. And then there would be a crisis of confidence in the brethren. Members would be harder to control. So the brethren choose to hide the fact that they can't come up with a way to spend the money. And I think that's what's really going on. But of course, that's not what they're going to say if pressed. So what might they say? This brings us to number 2, the millennium. In the full paper, you'll find all kinds of representations attributed to the First Presidency, the presiding bishopric, and EPA leaders who have all said that the Lord hasn't revealed yet what he wants to use this money for. The prevailing idea right now is that it's going to be used in the millennium, after the second coming of Christ. Do you honestly think that the IRS or Senate oversight would accept that as a tax-exempt purpose? I mean, apparently some people in EPA believe that the purpose of the EPA is to literally be the retirement fund for the church after the second coming in the millennium. And apparently some people at EPA really do think about their allocated capital as a dowry that they are preparing for the bridegroom when he returns. The reference, of course, is to the bride being the church as discussed in the book of Revelations. But then you have to ask yourself, would Jesus really have a hard time raising whatever kind of capital he needs, standing there in the sky? These might seem like crazy ideas to outsiders, but it is truly what the EPA leadership is hanging their hats on. The scarier twist on number 2 is that people at EPA also talk about a plan to use the money right before the second coming to, quote, prepare for it. That is just code for the very literal belief in Armageddon, the war between Gog and Magog, which are, prophetically speaking, the last things that are supposed to happen before Jesus' return. So check out these references on the church's own website. Here's a telling quote from the first one. The bankrupt nations, envying the wealth of the sons of Judah, will seek a pretext to make war upon them and will invade the Holy Land. The doctrine of the Mormon Church is that at some point, the name of the Mormon Church will be changed from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to the Church of Jesus Christ of the Last Days. And at that time, the sons of Judah, meaning Jesus' leadership or the COP, will have a wealth that all the nations of the earth will envy and are so going to invade Zion, meaning Jerusalem and the New Jerusalem in America. I know this sounds like a bad dystopian novel, and it might even be comical if the COP didn't take us versus them so seriously. Is this really how the righteous plan to win the battle between good and evil? I mean, by financing it? Mr. Nelson and his 12 companions literally believe that they need to stockpile a tax-free religious war chest in a lonely mountain called Ensign Peak to be used as an apocalypse arsenal to fend off the multiple armies of Gog and Magog. Apologists will accuse me of using hyperbole, but they know that in the minds of the most senior COP leadership, it is not hyperbole. Can any group of wealthy individuals, be they Mormon or Christian or Muslim or whatever, come together and make their own well-hidden EPA and in 2 decades scare all of the others with a 100 billion apocalypse arsenal? In my opinion, this is just a clarion call to policymakers. There is a limit to how much a church, a gigachurch, can serve both God and mammon. Make it a requirement that all churches bigger than, $150 billion make full financial statements to the IRS each year and total disclosure about their disbursements, the way that every other non-religious 501c3 organization must. The big ones can handle the extra accounting burden. Require these gigachurches to distribute or spend 5% of their assets every year the way all typical private foundations must. But the IRS is not the only body that needs to hold the COP, the CPB, and EPA leadership accountable. Right now I'm going to present and analyze several quotes from leaders in each of these 3 areas, and you judge whether they are being honest in their dealings with their fellow men. This guy, Mr. Dallin H. Oaks, is a member of the COP and a trustee of EPA. The Deseret News, which we all know is owned by the COP, reported, and this was, I believe, in 2016, that Mr. Oaks gave a lecture at the University of Oxford in which he boasted that the total contributions of the Mormon Church to all humanitarian aid efforts was a whopping 40 million with an M, per year, and that amount, 40 million, was pretty flat over the last 30 years. Again, this money didn't come from EPA, like it came from other legal entities that are under COP, under that pyramid. Regardless, I think it's helpful to point out that in 2016, $40 million equaled 0.05% of the 81 billion reserve of the reserves. It equaled 0.8% of that year's investment growth alone. Every quarter, Mr. Oaks sits in an IPC meeting with basically 9 white men, and they decide that for another year, $40 million should remain the ceiling on humanitarian aid, and that the reserves should stay frozen for yet another quarter. They pray about it and feel inspired to give $40 million each year, and each year put 200 times that amount into the reserves that are already well beyond $100 billion. What is the COP's purpose in donating annually what would amount to only a few hundredths of 1% of its reserves, and set that up as a testimony to the world that the COP is doing an impressive work? Could it be that they want to anchor the public and the membership and maybe the IRS into thinking that the COP must only have a small fraction of its true assets? Let Mr. Oakes tell the IRS and the Senate Oversight Committee why EPA has taken $20 billion in tax breaks without doing anything religious, educational, or charitable in 22 years. Actually, the better man for that job is Henry B. Eyring. He was a founding trustee of EPA and in the first presidency of the COP way back in 1997, and is still in that quarterly meeting with Mr. Oakes today. Apparently, the widow's mite is so sacred that it can never be spent once it's buried in a mountain. It's as if the COP has taken the parable of the talents way too literally. As the story goes, you'll recall one servant was chastised for hiding his entrusted money in the earth. He was wicked and slothful because he wasn't investing. But would the master be pleased with the COP for entombing its investments in a mountain peak? Isn't the deeper meaning of the parable to use your investment returns the way a master would want you to use them? Feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, sheltering the homeless. Neither surplus tithing nor invested surplus tithing returns have ever left EPA for a religious, educational, or charitable purpose. I don't think the master would be well pleased. Then there's this guy, Monsieur Gérald Gausset. I am going to recommend that you seriously buckle in to smash through his disingenuous and misleading statements. They are remarkable. He is the highest ranking bishop in the Mormon Church, president of the CPB, member of the IPC, and he gave a talk last year, called Financing Faith, that I'm going to quote from. Ultimately, all funds earned by the church's investments go back to supporting its mission to invite souls to come into Christ. Fact check. That certainly isn't true for at least $100 billion of those funds. 0 of those dollars have ever gone to helping souls come into Christ, and tithing isn't invested anywhere else outside of the EPA universe that we know of. Dear presiding bishop, try not to confuse all with 0 in your next speech. Here's another one. Whether church funds are from reserves or directly from the tithing of members, all are used for the singular purpose of supporting the mission of the church. Reserve funds exist for no other reason. In this context, funds means operating budgets. Mr. Gausset knows full well that EPA reserve funds have never supplemented an operating budget, ever. But he doesn't mind implying that they might have supplemented one, even though they haven't, by casually saying, whether the reserves do something or not, blah, 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 smoke and mirrors. He goes on, quote, these funds are invested solely to support the church's mission to preach the gospel to all nations and prepare for the Lord's second coming. Fact check. No money has ever flowed out of EPA for missionary work or to prepare for the second coming. It's simply not true. Dear presiding bishop, try not to confuse supporting with hoarding. He also says, in the United States, where churches and other nonprofit organizations are generally exempt from federal and state income tax, the church pays taxes on any income it derives from revenue-producing activities that are regularly carried on and are not substantially related to its tax-exempt purposes. Fact check. False. Multiple billions of dollars in income is derived from EPA investments, which is a revenue-producing activity each year. This activity is regular. It is not related to a tax-exempt purpose. The IRS makes clear that asset management is not related to a tax-exempt purpose. Here's a copy of EPA's 990T from 2017. Oh, how interesting. It paid $0 in that year, even though it made about $6 billion in investment returns. Now, I couldn't find a 990T for 2018 or 2016, but here are the others going back from 2015 to 2010. 2015, 0. 2014, 139K. 2013, 0. 2012, 26K. 2011, 0. 2010, 0. Try this one. Quote, the ongoing maintenance and upkeep, utilities, and use of the buildings can only be achieved as long as faithful members continue to support the church, close quote. Fact check. Maintenance, upkeep, utilities, and depreciation are mere rounding errors in the COP budget and definitely wouldn't show up in the EPA budget for 4 decimal places. But of course, EPA doesn't do anything religious or charitable anyways. This one is a doozy. Mr. Exposé, in 2018, quotes former COP CEO President Gordon B. Hinckley from 1985, saying, quote, the combined income from all of these business interests is relatively small and would not keep the work going for longer than a very brief period, close quote. That might have been something permissible to say in 1985, but Mr. Exposé knows that it is entirely misleading and grotesque to quote it now. Perhaps the COP's lawyers, Curtin and McConkie, advise him that it's not the reader's fault if they assume that the situation hasn't changed in 34 years, so quote the prophet. Fact check. The annual investment returns at EPA generate more cash every year than the total membership contributes every year. That's $7 billion per year compared to about $6 billion per year that is contributed. If every member of the Mormon Church stopped paying their tithing right now and forever, EPA would have enough to keep the work going for much longer than a very brief period. It would be able to keep the work going on in perpetuity, and EPA would still be growing. Dear Presiding Bishop, try not to confuse brief with perpetuity. If it's not obvious by now, this is just a sample of quotes that represent a sustained intent to deceive the members about the size of the COP's reserves in EPA. Leadership knew that they would benefit materially from that sustained deceit, and they did as the money kept rolling in, even though they knew that it wouldn't if members knew the truth about how much they had hoarded and how little of it was ever being used for anything good. That is the textbook definition of fraud. Sustained intent to deceive, knowing that they would benefit from it materially, and they did. So why would they commit this fraud? Because tithing is the best metric for evaluating the dedication of the church membership. Stakes and wards, they come and go, divide and consolidate, all as a function of tithing surplus per square mile. Only the most tithing faithful males get pulled up the ranks of the local and general church leadership or the priesthood. Without full tithing, the church cannot be managed. It really isn't about financing anymore. Money is now less relevant. It's about control. And I've got some more examples about that later. Now let's turn our attention to the representations from EPA leadership itself. This is called a Statement of Financial Condition. In 2001, the Patriot Act was passed. Mostly that was to keep people from accidentally helping terrorists manage their money. Basically, counterparties are required to, quote, know your client before onboarding with them. So, for example, a bank can't just be a custodian for just anyone, or a broker can't just trade on anyone's behalf. They have to see some due diligence documents first, which includes full financial statements. But EPA simply refuses to work with someone that asks to see its financial statements. So, instead, EPA provides a simple letter saying, don't worry, our assets are in excess of $5.0 billion, so you can trust us. If you don't want to take our word for it, here's a bank you can call. By the way, we used to own a controlling interest in that bank. Just as an aside, you have to admire their use of the significant digit in the .0. I mean, the idea is to make people think that EPA's total assets are well past 5 and really on their way to $6 billion. It also turns out to be true that the assets are well past $100 billion and really on their way to $101 billion. But of course, the bigger issue is that custodians and brokers who accept this letter instead go against industry best practices and against their own internal risk management policies. But some are not willing to forego business with EPA. Does the SEC care that brokers and custodians are circumventing industry best practices to make a buck with EPA? Do other clients of EPA's custodians know that their custodians are lax with VIP clients when it comes to the Patriot Act? It's one thing to deliberately make EPA look small to members with fraudulent statements. It's another thing to make EPA look small to custodians and brokers in the financial community. But it is another thing entirely to deliberately make EPA look small to the IRS. Did you catch it on the 990Ts I showed you earlier? Look at this one from 2007. Box H. Describe the organization's primary unrelated business activity. Investing. Okay, so they admit that investing is an unrelated business activity. So far, so good. Box C. Book value of all assets at end of year. Clearly, this must be the assets from investing. Roger Clark affirmed under penalty of perjury that the book value of EPA is $1 million. Again, with a decimal point, implying that all 7 digits here are significant. Does Roger Clark, the managing director of EPA and president, not know that the true book value of all of EPA's owned assets was $38 billion in 2007? He chose to report a number that is 38,000 times too small. He does the same thing in the next year. And in 2010, this time writing in last minute by hand the word over, perhaps to assuage his conscience, but not too much. Now the non-real estate investment assets are $40 billion. 2011, now solidifying the pattern by typing the word over, the truth, $41 billion. Now the instructions in the IRS code say that this must be the actual book value, not an approximation, not a threshold, the actual book value. 2012. Now Don Klaus is also ready to misrepresent the book value of all assets by a factor of 47,000. 2013, about $52 billion. 2014, about $58 billion. 2015, about $65 billion. 2017, it looks like they've just given up reporting any number at this point. No one is stopping them. I do think that the current church has come a long way since those days of Kirtland when there were all kinds of fraudulent institutions being created by the Mormon church. But it's probably fair to say that some of the regulation skirting culture at play at EPA today comes from those Joseph Smith days. So look at this interesting relic from history. You may or may not know that in 1837, Mormon founder Joseph Smith applied for a bank charter, which was denied by the state of Ohio. Defiantly and undauntedly, Mr. Smith decided to create his own bank and illegally print his own money, just as his father had taught him. For those of you who don't know, Joseph Smith's dad and Oliver Cowdery's dad, who were cousins, were repeat counterfeiters in multiple Vermont Supreme Court cases. Anyways, notice how unabashedly and mockingly Joseph Smith had the prefix anti and the suffix ing surround the word bank in faint fine print. If I can't have a true bank, then I'm going to have an anti-bank and no one can stop me. And I'm not dishonest because it says right on the money that this was an anti-bank, not a real bank. Well, the EPA is an anti-501c3. The COP and CPB and EPA leaders know it, and they do it unabashedly and mockingly, in my opinion, because they're following the example of a man that they sing praises to, Joseph Smith, because that's what he would do. In fact, that is what he did. So what else are they not coming clean about? No one knows. Well, I guess maybe a few people at the very top know whether there are other hidden stores of wealth besides EPA. I mean, there could be billions parked around the world just hanging out if they're there. These are the big reserves that EPA does know about. Again, this slide comes from EPA itself. It's Exhibit H.2. The total reserves, obviously, are way more than 124 billion. I don't know how much is sitting right now in Deseret Trust Company or Deseret Management Company Reserve Trust or certain holding companies or many, many property reserves. Some of you might know that the Mormon Church owns about 2% of the land of the state of Florida. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Some of those assets, yeah, they're hard to value because they're speculative land holdings, or because the assets don't produce any cash flows, or they don't mark to market very easily. But the ones in EPA are frequently marked to market, and they're all highly liquid. This is Exhibit R.1. In addition to the $7 billion in portfolio cash and treasury cash, EPA leadership affirmed to the COP and CPB that it could raise $7 billion within 6 months by simply not reinvesting the interest and principal from bonds and notes and paper as they mature. If needed, it could also liquidate 85% of the entire portfolio within 3 months by selling into normal markets without substantial disruption. In other words, no fire sale. They would just float the shares until they're gone. Has anyone in the world ever heard of an organization that is so big and so liquid and so inactive in every way? There's nothing like it. So what do I mean by inactive? As you can read in the full paper, EPA has no liability stream at all. There's no schedule for capital calls. There are no plans. And now they're stuck. So they just keep their heads down, don't ask questions, get a nice return on your part of the portfolio. And some people in the firm are thinking, someday the prophets will say something prophetic. Someday the seers will see something. Someday the revelators will reveal something. After 22 years and $100 billion? Probably not. Just for fun, let's look at how much money the COP sent to areas all around the world that are not self-supporting. This is Exhibit N in the full paper. You can see that in 2013, the COP gave $257 million to Brazil's church programs. On the flip side, in 2007, it gave $100,000 to Slovenia. In total, it sent $11.1 billion over 11 years abroad. The LDS Church reported that its total membership in 2013 was about 15.1 million members, and it can be verified that about 56.3% were living outside the United States and Canada at the time. So if you do the math, that turns out to be a little bit more than $10 per member per month. So you decide whether the shepherd would think that the international flock is being taken care of. It is generally true that from 2003 to 2013, the COP put more money into its reserve of the reserves than it spent on supplementing its members who can't support themselves. So how does the church make restitution? To the IRS, to the church membership, to the public? There are, of course, 5 steps to repentance. Recognize, feel sorrow, forsake, apologize, right the wrong. It isn't likely that the COP or EPA will do number 4. After all, Mr. Oakes, who is both a top 3 leader on the COP side and a trustee on the EPA side, has said, actually, let's just watch the clip. It's become a little bit of an internet meme, so please forgive the Star Wars music in the background.
In a Tribune story that we published on Tuesday, Elder Oaks, you were quoted as saying that the church doesn't seek apologies and we don't give them. And of course, this sparked a whole storm on social media about those who wonder how this view comports with Christian theology. Again, wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to that.
I'm not aware that the word apology appears anywhere in the scriptures, Bible or Book of Mormon. The word apology contains a lot of connotations in it and a lot of significance. We do not seek apologies. When our temple was desecrated in California, when people were fired and intimidated, when a lot of other coercive measures were used, we sought no apology.
It's wrong to criticize leaders of the church, even if the criticism is true.
Well, good and reasonable people will disagree with both of your fallacious appeals, Mr. Oakes. You certainly do not have to do any of the steps. But maybe some of the apostles will try to do some of the steps. Or will the IRS and the public compel them to be humble if they won't be humble on their own? Well, making restitution to the IRS is going to depend on how they view the situation. The most serious scenario is that the IRS determines that the COP never intended for EPA to be an active charitable organization in the first place. It pulls its 501c3 status retroactively, In that case, all the untaxed capital gains and all the investment growth from those untaxed capital gains and mandatory penalties and compounded interest over 22 years on all of that would probably amount to about $50 billion. That would be a big fight, and the COP would settle way before it got to any of that. The second scenario would be that the IRS determines that it should penalize the 501c3 every year that it didn't make distributions, or that it should pay capital gains but not on all of the investment growth from those untaxed capital gains. Or in either approach, the mandatory penalties and interest would bring it to something like 15 or 20 billion. And the math behind that is in the full paper. It's Exhibit Q. Of course, the COP is going to argue that the IRS can only look back so far, suggesting that the statute of limitation applies, trying to get that number as small as possible, and then just settle. My guess is that it'll probably come clean after 3 or 4 years of delays and plausibly deniable attempts at obstruction, and then it'll finally privately commit to doing better and settling for, $5 billion fine and a slap on the wrist. And it'll then find a way to do the minimum that it has to with the tens of billions in investment growth per year, just whatever it has to do to keep its tax-exempt status. This investigation will probably trigger what the IRS calls a, quote, commensurate test. That's just a formal test for deciding whether a parent church is behaving enough like a church that it should still keep its tax-exempt status. I personally think that EPA's tax-exempt status is as sure as gone, at least for a time, but this whole situation will throw the COP's tax-exempt status also into question. In Exhibit F of the full paper, you can see the math behind a common sense commensurate test. The basic idea is that you can first calculate the total activity rate of a church, and then ask yourself what fraction X of the total activity rate was for religious, educational, or charitable purposes. Because the COP uses tithing to top off each of its geographical areas, functions, and departments each year, you can actually make the calculation really easily. The total activity rate is just the total net outflow divided by the total assets. And the total net outflow is just the annual tithing received minus the annual tithing surplus to EPA. The total assets would be the EPA universe plus the total of all the other assets of the church, which is probably around 200 billion. That's a guess, but it's a pretty educated guess. That gives a percentage of about 3%, which is extremely low for a church. But unfortunately for the COP, it gets worse because not all of its activity is religious, educational, or charitable. The COP has got tons of for-profit businesses and significant unrelated business income, so we have to multiply the total activity rate by X, which is a fraction that's less than 1. At this point, the viewer is free to substitute their own guesses for X into the equation, but I would guess that the total activity rate for 2019 is probably closer to 2.4%, and X is probably closer to 0.5. Giving a REC rate, or religious, educational, and charitable rate, of about 1.2%. Of course, I recognize that the church is going to try to argue that the numerator shouldn't be so small and the denominator shouldn't be so big. Let them do that to the IRS and to the Senate Oversight Committee and to their members and to the public. I have no problem with that. But until they do, I think any thinking person would say that the COP has the obligation to prove whether or not it could still pass a commensurate test. The burden of proof is on them, and the ball is in their court. Some of you might know the IRS really does not enjoy trying to get money out of churches. It's still suffering from when, after many years, it gave Scientology back its tax-exempt status, and they didn't really collect much for a decade of really hard work. So why would they be interested in challenging a church again? So what is the IRS's willingness to investigate the EPA? It hasn't been easy for them to collect from wayward churches, basically for 4 reasons. Number 1, it's hard to get the right information from entities that don't make regular filings and who aren't forthcoming or transparent with their finances. Number 2, often there's little money or no money to collect at all. 3, perpetrators sometimes flee. And 4, attaching fines or liens to a financially empty church usually means hurting the innocent members, the people who are left over after the leaders flee, and the IRS doesn't like to do that. But none of those concerns really apply here in this case. So number 1, the IRS has a ton of good information to start their investigation. Number two, there's an ungodly amount of just highly liquid assets already set apart from all church and affiliate operations. Number three, the perpetrators, they come from a gerontocracy and they're not going to pose a serious flight risk. And four, fines of pretty much any size can be paid without disruption to any day-to-day activity. Indeed, they could pay literally up to $100 billion and it would not impact one program. And EPA would just keep growing all over again to another $100 billion in another 2 decades. Hopefully this time they would have made lawful distributions and no misapplication of funds. If you're a current Mormon listening to this, what would you want to see have happen? Are you going to tell that to anyone on social media or write a letter to the First Presidency? Change only happens because we make it happen and we speak truth to power. This is what I would want. After paying the IRS, the Mormon Church should take $50 billion and give it back to the poorest members of the church, starting exclusively in third world countries, dollar for dollar. The church has full and immaculate records on all of this. It can sort the list, smallest to largest, and then it should start cutting those checks until $50 billion is gone. It needs to repent of fiscal gluttony. It should communicate a plan for using invested tithing and its returns to the members for their sustaining vote. If they won't do something like this, then maybe think about respectfully saying opposed or no confidence in the next General Conference. How bad is this violation of the public trust? Can we put a number on it? Well, we've already put a number on what we think the IRS should be able to claw back, but can we put a number on how much the public thought that they were getting from letting the COP create EPA with the tax-exempt status 22 years ago? Yeah, we can. If EPA were to have had the exact same growth performance and contributions from the COP, but had merely paid 5% distributions each year since its inception, the way all non-religious private foundations do, then EPA's OAUM would be $32.4 billion instead of $99.1 billion today. I assert that that is the true tragedy here. $66 billion is the minimum cumulative good in the world that the public might rightfully have expected from giving EPA its trust. Any other interesting stories about EPA to share? You'll remember Boyd K. Packer. He was the senior apostle while the health of Mr. Thomas S. Monson, the CEO of the COP at the time, was failing. Anyways, the story goes that he came to EPA's managing director, Roger Clark, wanting to know how much Ensign Peak had amassed and the details of its structure. Mr. Clark told Mr. Packer that he could not share such details. Mr. Packer reportedly said, "I think I should know. I'm the most senior apostle and president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, and I'm a breath away from being the next prophet. I think I should be prepared." Mr. Clark reaffirmed that he had been instructed specifically not to reveal that information to Mr. Packer. Apparently, Mr. Packer went away perturbed and unsatisfied, and he died soon thereafter, before he could join the First Presidency and know the true value of EPA. That is a third-hand story, but apparently it was retold several times by Richard B. Wiles, who was the head of fixed income at EPA at the time. Here's a really quick story on the topic of financial risk and controls. In Exhibit O in the full paper, you can see there that there's this long email exchange that explains how a potential mechanism for dark money was discovered by an employee of the firm. Basically, there was a segregation of duties problem together with a worst practice of deleting receivables, and that caused the firm to completely lose track of millions of dollars. The employee took it to top management, and they said that they would take care of it immediately, but the same employee rediscovered the worst practice and the missing control by accident years later, and discovered that top management had intentionally reintroduced that same shady practice under the radar. Why? So the employee raised the potential fraud flag again, and the leadership conducted another investigation, but the persons responsible for investigating were also the persons who had reinstated the worst practice in the first place. This is important because, to make a long story short, deleting receivables can constitute an effective way to make untraceable payments. I'm not saying that this specifically happened, but if you wanted to bribe someone in a foreign country, you could buy something like a bond from their government, and then just forget to collect on it later. And if the person in EPA who accepts the money is also the person who handles the journal entries and deletes the receivable, then who's going to know? Seriously, go read those emails. Okay, does any of this relate to what happened with Mormon leaks in 2018?
Breaking news into the live desk right now. New documents have just been released by Mormon Leaks. Take a look here. They have uncovered 13 LLCs tied to the LDS Church. They linked each LLC to the LDS Church by using the domain names, which are registered to the organization tasked with legally protecting all their intelligence property.
The next day, Chief Investment Officer Robert Neidiger from the EPA called an emergency meeting to discuss whether new holding companies needed to be created since the current structure could no longer obfuscate EPA's equity positions. The leak was mostly correct, with some minor errors. The LLCs actually had $31.9 billion in U.S. stocks at the end of 2017, but there was another $3.7 billion in domestic stocks that were externally managed at the time, but that's just a small detail. It was mostly right. At the end of that meeting, EPA decided that creating new entities would probably just draw unwanted attention and probably be too obvious. So to avoid follow-on stories in the media and reinforce public perceptions of obfuscation, EPA concluded that a slower strategy over many years might be more effective for full reconcealment. Kind of a funny aspect of the story is that it turns out this information wasn't leaked at all. Some random guy discovered that the 13 LLCs were all created on the same day and all had domain names that happened to be hosted by servers that also hosted some sites from LDS.org and Mormon.org, and that person just connected the dots and turned out to be right. You were probably wondering on this slide what commingled funds are. Like, what is that? Money commingled with scripture? It turns out that before 2015, EPA offered mutual fund-like services to BYU, other church affiliates, for-profit entities, meaning that they could use their money to purchase a share of various EPA funds. But that turned out to be a mistaken structure because BYU receives federal funding, and by federal law, had to get audited from time to time by an independent third party, in this case, Deloitte & Touche. In order for Deloitte to verify the market value of BYU's endowment, it needed to verify the market value of EPA's funds because BYU had purchased a share of EPA's funds. But this was totally unacceptable to the COP and to the CPB because they didn't want anyone at Deloitte to discover the true size of EPA. So the COP leaned on Mark Stevens, a Mormon and an audit director at Deloitte at the time, to vouch for the audit without letting any auditors see, which he did for multiple years. Eventually, Deloitte just felt really uncomfortable with the arrangement. I mean, it doesn't represent industry best practices for obvious reasons. And in response, EPA painstakingly stripped out all affiliate interests in all EPA funds and created separate accounts dedicated to affiliate money so that independent auditors would see no further into EPA. In other words, Deloitte would have to audit just a cup of water instead of an entire ocean. It's just weird that they still call these funds commingled funds. That just sounds bad, but they're right here in the EPA universe. What's left of it right now is $1.8 billion. So here's another story that highlights just how skittish the COP can be when it comes to finding out how big EPA has become. July 2012, Bloomberg wrote an article on Mormon church finances, which made the COP apparently very nervous. When leadership found out that EPA's intra-company instant messages were being stored on Bloomberg servers and theoretically potentially readable by a curious Bloomberg employee or a hacker, they required that all EPA employees immediately cease using Bloomberg chats for internal communications and then implemented its own solution. So the firm was paranoid that some Bloomberg employee might try and reverse engineer the size of EPA from text messages between EPA employees. And if that true size collectively were ever known, it might jeopardize the tax-exempt status of EPA if it ever got leaked. All right, in 2017, here's another story. At some point, EPA learned that a particular corporate bond broker with whom EPA had done a material amount of trades was on the board of Open Stories Foundation. The firm panicked because OSF supported Mormon Stories podcast. EPA was concerned that Open Stories might be seeking confidential information about the COP or EPA, so they questioned the bondbroker's true loyalty to Mormonism and feared that she or he might sympathize with apostates. So the firm settled on ceasing to do all transactions with that bondbroker. At least one EPA employee objected strongly to the obvious bigotry of religious discrimination towards business associates, but suggested that the client, the CPB, make the final decision. So they took it to the CPB, and purportedly the official response from the CPB was to do nothing with the bondbroker, business as usual, followed by a wink and a nod. No trades were ever made with that bondbroker ever again. Okay, here's a quick thing to say about the private equity part of the portfolio. Private equity is the smallest and the youngest of all of the non-cash allocated capital inside of Inside Peak. Now, I know at least of one instance within EPA of someone either taking money from third parties or providing investment advice without being registered, which of course is against the law, for which that person was fined, took a test, moved on, fine. But are there other instances where EPA partnered in a joint venture or took capital or advised another fund on mutually beneficial investment activity without being registered? That would be a very serious allegation and something for the SEC to look into. So I'm just going to ask a question. Are there wealthy, speculating Mormon businessmen who have lumped their capital alongside the Lord's capital, considering it to be a more sure investment? I'm just going to leave it there. Some of you might know that recently the COP announced that the monthly dues for missionary service would increase by 25% in 2020. That is from $400 per missionary per month to $500 per missionary per month for residents of these many countries. I understand that it is going to remain at $400 per missionary per month other places in the world. Anyways, the COP and the CPB sure don't mind putting the squeeze on the middle-class family that's got 2 kids in college, maybe one on a mission. Does such a family know that with approximately 70,000 full-time missionaries, the entire full-time missionary program currently costs only $336 million annually? The reserve of the reserves makes 20 times that amount annually as investment income alone. And EPA has never distributed any money to support the missionary effort. Why is it so important to raise the price on the missionary program? I think that's a very fair question that members have the right to ask. You might be wondering at this point, why am I getting this information from you? Are you the whistleblower? I'm not the whistleblower, and I'm not a reporter. But I did interview the whistleblower extensively, and I checked every fact as thoroughly as I could. I wrote up every word and made every exhibit that exists in the full paper entitled Letter to an IRS Director. I did that with the information that the whistleblower freely gave me. I own the copyright on it and on this video. Anyways, the whistleblower signed and sent me the official whistleblower submission form 211 with a notarized cover letter, and both were submitted to the IRS under penalty of perjury. I printed out his submission package, created the thumb drive with the many files of supporting information, and certified mailed that whole package to the IRS from my hometown, which is outside of the state of Utah. Incidentally, the whistleblower office is located in Ogden, Utah, of all places, which is 90% Mormon. So it's very likely that some law of consecration, oath-making, temple recommend carrying Mormon working at the IRS is more loyal to the COP than to the IRS. So I'm sure that the brethren know about this already and are preparing their talking points. One more thing to say on this issue, and then we can start wrapping up. If you're a true believing Mormon, vigilante TBM, leave the whistleblower and his family alone. Don't try to figure out who they are. They don't want their names anywhere. Don't out them. Don't treat their children differently at school. To the lawyers of Curtin and McConkie, I know that you are part of an adversarial judicial system and that you believe that defending your client's interests makes whatever you do moral, but that isn't necessarily true. So before you try to ruin people's lives for telling the truth about something that really should be told, before you engage the Strengthening Church Membership Committee or sick the Danites on me, or whatever you're calling them these days, leave me and my family alone. Don't call my parents who are serving a mission in Argentina for the church to try to get information out of them and pressure them into containing this story. Stop sending people to the whistleblower's house and leaving intimidating statements like, I just want to make sure that you don't do anything that you're going to regret. If that wasn't you that did these things, well, then please accept my apology. If you really want to do something to strengthen the church members, spend some of the $100 billion on something religious, educational, or charitable. Regardless of whether or not you go low, the members that we both care about, I believe, are going to go high. As the late Maya Angelou liked to say, and today Oprah Winfrey also likes to say, when you know better, do better. And now that you know a lot more about EPA than you ever did before, look at this list of calls to action and decide right now, what are you going to do? I am asking the IRS to conduct a full and formal investigation of the COP's and EPA's balance sheets, charitable activities, and legal/governance structures, exact taxes and penalties and mandatory interest for inactivity, for disqualified distributions, any unpaid capital gains, perform and publicize the results of a commensurate test on the COP together with all its supporting organizations, including EPA, render a judgment as to whether the COP and or EPA should lose their tax-exempt status for a time or indefinitely, prevent capital flight by seizing or freezing EPA assets pending the investigations, and provide whatever relief to the public it may deem necessary. I'm going to ask the Congress and the Senate to provide the COP and EPA leadership an opportunity to explain themselves. Why did they take tax breaks for 22 years to the tune of $20 billion without any legitimate activity at all and without any plan for any future legitimate activity? Please hold the COP and EPA leaders personally accountable for their public misstatements. Require each 501c3 that is classified as a religion or an integrated auxiliary to a religion that is above a behemoth gigachurch size to disclose and file to the IRS everything that any typical 501c3 must disclose and file, including distributions or a lack of distributions. If that means classifying supporting organizations to religious public charities above a threshold size as private foundations instead of supporting organizations for the purposes of regulating minimum distributions and reporting, then let's do that. But please find a way to protect smaller, well-behaving religious organizations from cumbersome regulations and additional red tape that seem to be necessary for gigachurches like this one. And this probably sounds weird, but I think we need to create a church offender registry that lists corporations and offending trustees so that the public can know that these are the institutions and persons that have violated the public trust in the past and may do so again in the future. Now I'm going to speak directly to the COP and to EPA. Stipulate that you've not given $1 to a charitable purpose in 22 years. Come clean. You do not need to wait for an investigation to own up to this behavior. Apologize to membership for hoarding $124 billion of widows' mites. Become transparent with all of your finances. Reveal any other hidden stores of wealth. And commit to distributing perhaps a minimum of 5% of investments or assets each year, the way that all typical private foundations do. Apologize for deliberately misrepresenting the church's financial position to make it seem smaller than it was with your carefully worded statements, and for decades of elusive and dodgy representations about how the monies are being spent. Cooperate with the IRS, pay the fines immediately, adopt honest governance structures with your supporting organizations in which the supporting and supported are actually attentive and responsive. Finally, repent of fiscal gluttony. Right the wrong. If you're a member of the COP, learn where your tithing goes and where it doesn't go. Hold COP leadership to the same standard of truth and honesty in their dealings with the IRS that the COP requires of members to attend a temple. Also, I would say, Be wary of state presidents and bishops around the world who consistently teach members that they should give their charity money and even personal estates to the church because at least they can be assured that the money is going to a good cause. They often say that other charities have high overhead and you can't be sure that much of it is actually going to a good place. In giving to the church, they can have higher confidence that it is being put to work. These well-intentioned words are literally the farthest words from the truth that can be spoken. Your money will sit in a mountain until a religious war happens, or it'll be used on post-apocalyptic reconstruction. That's the choice that you're making. So here's my call to action for the general public. Contact your senators and representatives. Pressure them to legislate. Pressure them to fix the gigachurch loophole. Use social media to spread your personal views concerning this whistleblower report. Like the video, share it, and the PDF on social media. Okay, you've stuck with me this far. Here are my closing thoughts. In 2012, Reuters quoted Marlon K. Jensen, then church historian, on the topic of recent LDS membership attrition. Quote, "Not since a famous trouble spot in Mormon history, the 1837 failure of a church bank in Kirtland, Ohio, have so many left the church. Maybe since Kirtland, we've never had a period of, I'll call it apostasy, like we're having now." 182 years ago, at extreme cost to its membership, the Ohio-based COP survived the collapse of its anti-bank. It uprooted itself again and relocated to the Wild West. Today, can the Utah-based COP survive the collapse of its anti-501c3? Probably, but at what cost to its membership? It might have to relocate again, perhaps to the Cayman Islands. At the end of the day, the IRS, the Senate, the court of public opinion, and you, the viewer, need to weigh in. Does EPA pass the smell test? Does it quack like a 501c3 or not? Or are Jesus' 12 apostles more like Thorin's 12 dwarves who, not parting with a single coin, make a last stand atop a lonely mountain full of gold called Ensign Peak?